Ever since starting a YouTube channel, I'd been searching for a new desk to work at. I had a few contenders in mind for the kind of size and style that I wanted, and obviously I wanted to find a nice design that was worn or damaged so that I could restore it myself. Then along came this thing. This is basically the flat top version of the Gunnar Nielsen secretary desk that I restored back in episode 3. So same designer, same workshop, same time period, and many of the same design features. The only catch with this one is that obviously everything but the drawers had been painted white. So despite getting it for a fraction of its normal market value, I had to assume that all this paint was hiding some nasty scratches or stains on the desktop, which is of course teak veneer with solid teak edge banding. And so the big question was going to be how bad it was and how well I'd be able to repair it.
Well, find out what's underneath it, I guess.
Although I regularly use paint stripper, actually stripping paint is not something I've done very often, and although I can definitely see the appeal in it, it's not something I personally enjoy all that much. A more complex design like this desk also requires a much larger investment of time because of all the angles, tight corners, and different compartments to contend with. In addition to the two banks of drawers on the front, the desk also has a single shelf or bookcase on the backside, and even though I planned on placing it in a corner, I don't like to do things by halves, and I was committed to removing all of the paint, especially if I decided that it didn't suit my needs and I needed to resell it. Suffice to say, even after taking everything apart, it was still going to be a long and messy process. There was a lot of paint on this thing, to the point where it had filled out the wood grain, which suggests it was primed with some kind of high density filler. It was clear that an aerosol was used for at least parts of it, but in any case it was going to be difficult getting all of the paint out of all of the thousands of little pores, where neither a scraper nor sandpaper would be able to reach them. The big question, of course, was the top, and nothing could have prepared me for what was waiting. After a generous amount of paint stripper and a lot of mineral spirits, I managed to finally get a look at the condition of the veneer underneath, only to discover that it was in near perfect condition. That's right, aside from a couple of light, superficial scratches, this desktop was undamaged and free from marks or stains. The veneer was intact and showed no signs of ever being sanded, and as I continued stripping back the rest of the paint from the desk, it became clear that the entire piece was in excellent condition. As to why somebody would paint it, I can only speculate that at some point in time, one of its owners felt that it was clashing with their contemporary IKEA furniture, and thought that a coat of white paint would make it look more modern. But this is where things started getting tricky, because despite getting the majority of the paint off, every surface on this piece was still covered in thousands of tiny specks of white paint which was sitting in the pores of the wood grain, and so I decided to give all of the main surfaces some steam treatment with the iron, just to try and lift up the grain a little bit and hopefully make it easier to sand off some more of the paint. The logic of doing this is unclear, because the water will not soak into any area which is sealed or painted, but I thought it was at least worth a try. After everything had dried, I gave the desktop a scuff sand with the machine to see what difference it had made, and although it definitely looked a bit cleaner, it hadn't really helped in removing the paint in the deeper pores. I was able to get the scratches out with some careful hand sanding, but the entire desktop was still covered in these tiny little specks, which had to come out one way or the other. Next tool on the list was the wire brush. I had just picked this up at the hardware store, anticipating I'd need one, but I guess they'd sold out of the larger sizes because this little toothbrush sized thing was the only one left, and so I just had to make the best of it. I tried using various solvents, from mineral spirits to universal paint thinner and even acetone, which definitely helped in lifting the paint, but it dried so fast that all the paint and dirt that was being dissolved would just dry again before I had the chance to wipe it off, and so after doing this for the better part of a day on all of the painted surfaces, I mostly ended up with a dirty looking surface that was almost worse than before. I even tried ironing the desktop again to see if I could draw some of the dirt and paint up into the cloth, but that didn't really help that much either, and so I resorted to just standing it vertically and cleaning it with mineral oil and a scouring pad, in the hopes that I could lift the paint in the dirt and then get it to drain off onto a towel on the ground, which finally seemed to work. I repeated the same process on the other parts before giving everything a final sand with 180 grit. At this point, I'd been working for about 3 full days just trying to get the paint off this thing, and so I was glad to finally be moving ahead towards the finishing phase of this project. While we're on the topic of paint removal, I'd like to give a shout out to Barry from Mad City Modern. Barry is the master of paint removal, and he has a great channel where most of his projects involve heavy amounts of paint stripper, whereas I can tell you right now that paint removal is not something you're going to see on a regular basis on my channel. Barry is really good at it though, and he's been extremely generous with his time and offering guidance to people like me who are just starting out on YouTube. So if you're into that type of restoration, I will put a link to his channel in the description. I gave the top a final sand with the machine, and it seemed that things were looking good, though at this point I did end up blowing through the veneer on one of the corners, which I will show you later. It wasn't bad, but it was a self-inflicted wound, and those ones can be the toughest to live with. Because this desk was intended to be for my own personal use, I decided I would try an experimental finish just to see how it came out. This was really just a variation on the basic Danish oil recipe, where I mixed some tung oil varnish, some boiled linseed oil, and some mineral spirits in equal parts to create a simple wipe-on finish which would give a natural medium luster look, with a bit of added durability thanks to the varnish. This is something I've seen a lot of other woodworkers on YouTube use, with the only difference being that I decided to use tung oil varnish instead of wipe-on poly, hoping that I would get similar results. As soon as I started applying it though, I realized the terrible mistake that I'd made. There were still thousands of little specks of paint trapped in the pores. I honestly thought I had gotten rid of them all, but I hadn't wiped everything down after the final sand to check. This was a massive oversight on my part, and at this point I should have stopped applying the finish immediately and returned to cleaning, but at the time I thought I'd be able to glaze over everything with wood stain later on and make the paint disappear. But it wasn't just a question of white paint specks. The oil on the surface had also revealed just how patchy and dirty many of the surfaces had become as a result of cleaning them with acetone, and so I reluctantly had to accept that I would need to start again from scratch with paint stripper. This was literally just a case of rinse and repeat, but this time with a larger wire brush, followed by some very thorough sanding, although it did present me with an opportunity to complete a repair which I had ignored the first time around. One of the leg assemblies had come loose and needed re-gluing, and there was also a crack in one of the legs which had grown since the last time I sanded it. Re-gluing the spreaders was straightforward enough, but the crack is something I would have to return to. In the interim, I had already re-sanded the desktop, which was now looking much better, and I had also decided to stick with my standard finishing routine on this desk, rather than the experimental finish I tried the first time around. I started with my favorite mahogany oil stain, which always works well with teak and tends to give a shimmering golden red, depending on the properties of the timber. Because they had never been painted, the drawers were the only part of the desk which had not presented any problems. This meant that they didn't need to be stripped down a second time before staining, and so I just stained on top of the previous finish that I had applied. Moving back to the leg assemblies, I removed the clamps and gave them a final sand before applying the stain and leaving everything to dry off for a few hours. As we move from spring into summer, the drying time on these oil stains is becoming shorter and shorter, and so I'm able to move a little bit faster than I'm able to in the winter months. If I'm using the mahogany wood stain, I'll often then combine it with garnet shellac, which has very similar properties in terms of the colors. It's a very earthy brown with a lot of red in it, and so it can enhance the red in the wood stain depending on the lighting conditions. When I'm filming under the studio lights, the finish will generally look a bit lighter and perhaps a bit colder than it really is, and so it can be difficult getting the red to translate on camera in a way that is natural and true to form. My plan for the finish was to apply 3 coats of shellac and then add 2 coats of tung oil varnish to the desktop. Because the body, drawers and legs would not need to withstand so much direct contact with other objects, I decided to skip the top coat and keep the finish light, whereas the desktop on the other hand would need to withstand daily use from things like laptops and coffee mugs, and so the tung oil varnish was an absolute necessity. Another reason I tend to be selective with where I use this particular product is that it's very expensive to get here in Europe. As far as I can tell, there are no retailers in Germany who are importing waterlogged products, and so by the time I've paid for shipping and customs taxes, a single 1-gallon can of this stuff is costing me around 250 euros. I've considered other alternatives, and if it's a cheaper piece of furniture, I will use wipe-on poly, but when it comes to designer pieces which need to be protected, I haven't found anything else which offers the look and the properties of their original tung oil varnish. I made sure to be generous with it to ensure that the coverage was even and a third coat would not be required, and took the opportunity between coats to address the veneer damage I had previously created with the sanding machine. Off camera, I had already used some brush tip furniture markers to paint in some of the wood grain and try to match the colors as best I could, but to be honest it hadn't come out that great, and so I needed to use some more wood stain to blend this patch out a bit more. Although, as you can see here, the mahogany wood stain didn't really blend in that much at this stage either, and so I would have to let it dry out a bit and take another look at it later on. With everything drying off, I turned my attention to the crack in the leg, which I still hadn't repaired because I hadn't decided whether I was going to repair it or not. Because of the shape of the assembly, a clamp wasn't really the ideal tool, and so I decided to just drill a pilot hole on an angle through the middle of the leg, followed by a screw, which I sunk in and tried to make it look as if it belonged there. I then used some melting wax to fill in the crack, which ended up burning the shellac a little bit, but I was able to clean it up well enough in the end, and I don't think it looks too bad. Definitely better than an open crack. After giving the varnished desktop a few days to dry off, it was looking good and was ready to be polished, along with the rest of the desk. As always, I used a 320 grit sanding sponge, followed up by a black Scotch Brite pad, and then rubbed on some teak coloured brie wax with fine steel wool, being sure to use as little as possible. This particular variant is a very dark reddish brown wax, which is great for sinking into the pores and enhancing the natural contrast of the wood grain. You just have to be careful not to use too much. I tried to add a little extra wax to the corner where I had sanded through the veneer, but once again my efforts to blend it all in didn't really amount to much, and so I had to just accept the fact that it wasn't going to be perfect. This little mistake, along with the big one where I'd put a coat of finish on before I'd gotten all the paint off, were both the result of lapses in concentration, so basically working too long and too late without enough rest. I often set myself a schedule for when I need to finish one project or start the next one. The problem is that you never know for certain how any given project will develop and how long it will take, and so I guess the lesson in this one was to just slow down a bit, because all I had done in trying to rush things along was to create more work for myself. With all of the surfaces now waxed and polished, all that remained was to reassemble the desk and run through some final touches. In addition to sanding and oiling the underside of the desk, I decided that because the veneer damage was located on the front right corner, I would also rotate the desktop around so that it would be situated at the back left, where it was less likely to be seen. This involved realigning the desktop and drilling some more pilot holes, but that was easy enough, and the desk was definitely looking a lot better this way. I also drilled some pilot holes in the undersides of the legs so that I could install some new gliders. I normally reserve these ones for heavier furniture, but as this desk was quite low, I wanted every millimeter of extra height I could get. After that, it was just a case of sanding and oiling all of the drawers, although for some reason the top left drawer was sticking a little, and even after a second round of sanding with the machine, I ended up having to use some furniture lubricant to get it sliding properly. But despite all the potential setbacks and problems you can encounter on a project like this, being persistent is what pays off in the end, and on the whole I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. Even if I eventually decide that I want to sell it and get something else, I've got a beautiful desk which somebody else is sure to fall in love with. Thanks for watching.